All right.
All right.
We good? Everybody's got the water?
I'm good.
All right, great.
With no label on it, too.
Yes, I'm assuming it's safe.
Quality control.
Right.
Good morning. Hey, folks, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you. I know a number of folks are finishing up breakfast or getting out of meetings from this morning, but if you could find your table, we're anxious to get started. We have a lot of great content to share with you today. First, thanks for making it back for day 2 of the Skills Summit. It's great to have you here. Good morning. Day 1 was awesome. We learned a lot. I learned a lot. We had a great session with our A team of policy staff that kind of gave us an overview of some of the conversations that we're having here in DC and that you will be a part of tomorrow. We had a really exciting plenary at the end of the day yesterday, confirming that America is on our side on these issues. Republican, Democrat, Independent. The voting public wants to hear more about what it is that folks here in this city are doing about investing in people, investing in the work that you all are doing. And that's incredibly empowering as we think about some of the conversations that we're going to have up on Capitol Hill tomorrow. So today we're going to have some more discussion about some of the other policy issues that you're likely to hear about as you're walking around Washington, D.C., things that I'm sure that you are talking about back at home in the work that you're doing in your organizations or in your companies, training and hiring and advancing people. And one of the things that I'm sure a lot of folks hear about, read about, is actually one of the few workforce issues that makes it into the newspaper every once in a while, is this issue around the future of work. This is something that a conversation that we started here in our organization at last year's Skills Summit, and I'm very excited about continuing that conversation today with some great colleagues up here on the panel with me. I should also mention that we're keeping in mind that we're going to continue the conversation with members of Congress, including 2 of them who are going to be here for lunch with us this afternoon, reinforcing that idea that there are Republicans and Democrats who are ready to work together on these issues. And then tonight we're going to have the EverFun Awards reception. I'll make sure that you all make it for that as well. So, to get us kicked off this morning for our future work conversation, I want to introduce Maggie Koziol. She's a senior manager and the workforce development lead for corporate citizenship at Deloitte. And Deloitte's been one of our thought partners on this whole issue of the future of work and the kind of conversations that we hope we can start to have here in Washington, D.C. that start to drill down a little bit from the bigger macro level issues about what automation and AI and digitalization is going to mean for America's workers, and really what are the specific kinds of policy responses that we're going to need to support your work and to support those people and those companies as we go through this pretty significant structural change in our labor market. So I want to give Maggie a chance to talk a bit about her work and the work here at Deloitte and about this series, and then we're going to get the conversation started. So Maggie, come on up.
Thanks, Andy. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Power. I'm really pleased to be here this morning to introduce this series and to be working with the National Skills Coalition as they dig into how the future of work will impact every sector and every level of the U.S. economy, and what all of us, whether we're in the nonprofit, public, or private sector, can do to help prepare for this future. As the world's largest professional services firm, at Deloitte, we're thinking about the future of work as we serve our clients, but also in the context of how we do business, whether it's through our work with the National Skills Coalition or our own Pathfinder program. We're committed to workforce development and know that in order to build a strong, inclusive, and diverse workforce for the future, we need to commit to creating opportunities, to investing in people, for skills development, and pathways for opportunity for everyone. So the purpose of our discussion today, this is the first of a series in the More Than One series, and we're starting to think about how the future of work impacts may exacerbate issues of inequality. That's what we're going to focus on today. So research tells us that the majority of job losses from automation may be borne by workers earning less than $20 an hour with a high school degree or less, and that many of the people affected by this will be workers of color. Mid and late career workers with less developed digital skills than their younger counterparts may also be more vulnerable, as are a range of other workers. Today, we're going to start talking about how to prepare for this future, the roles of different stakeholders, and actions we should all consider taking. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Now, I think as Andy mentioned, today's session is being streamed on Facebook Live, so welcome to those of you watching online. You'll see that there are a number of resources linked to the event's Facebook page that will be referenced during today's discussion, including some analyses of these issues by Deloitte. Those here in the room at the summit can find those resources through the session page on your Skills Summit app. And hashtags, the ever important hashtags, if you want to add to the discussion in the social media sphere, are Skills Summit 2019 and More Than One FOW, Future of Work.
I like that.
We'll also be taking questions from the in-person audience here after the panel, so please get those ready. So thank you again. Thank you for giving me the time to open the session. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andy, who will introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Maggie. So welcome to our friends on Facebook Live. Again, this is a session entitled There's More Than One Future of Work, particularly focused on the uneven prospects for different workers in our labor market as we're looking at these changes moving forward. Good morning to my colleagues.
Good morning.
Anxious to have the conversation with you all. Let me just level set a little bit for everyone in the room about why it is that we want to have this conversation about the fact that there's more than one future of work. Everybody up here, many of the folks in this room have been part of, I'm sure, a number of different conversations about what is the future of work, what will be the future of work. And I think a lot of those conversations have tended to be focused very much at the very large, macro, structural level set of questions. A lot of it's been around the debate about how many jobs are going to be lost or eliminated, how many jobs are going to be created, how many jobs are going to be changed. And because these are large structural issues, I think that the conversation, particularly even when it comes to policy making or potential policy making here in Washington, D.C., has also tended to kind of focus at that very top line level. And there's been a tendency towards one-size-fits-all kind of responses to what we could do around these issues. But the reality is, and for everybody who is in this room who's doing real work in your communities with real working people, with real companies and industries, you know that how this new infusion of technology is playing out very differently for different types of workers. It's playing out differently for different types of industries, and even for different companies, size firms within some of those industries. And so that's some of what we're trying to unpack today, as we as a community of grassroots experts that are doing this work, we want to be able to inform the conversation here in Washington, and I'm sure back in many of our state capitals, about how it is that we need to piece out how these impacts are going to play out differently for different folks, and the kinds of policy responses that we need to work into the conversation in some way. Just to talk a little bit about kind of what the big numbers are, I mean, and there is some debate about this. There are estimates as many as 40 to 50% of current jobs would be eliminated in the next 20 years. I think that more recent studies have probably broken that out a little bit, looking less at individual jobs and more at the tasks that are going to be impacted by technology. And once you break it out that way, and there's a couple of different research organizations, very well regarded, that have, using different methodologies, have all pretty much come up with the same estimations. There's probably 10 to 15% of jobs that are going to be completely eliminated. There's differences of opinion about how many new jobs are going to be created through that. There certainly is a debate about whether or not all those are going to be good jobs or bad jobs. Folks might have seen Eduardo Porter's article in the New York Times about this just within the past couple days. But the larger number of folks is going to be the 60% or 60% or so of our current workforce whose jobs are going to significantly change, where they're going to be working alongside of or in application of technology. And the question is, how many of those workers are prepared for that change? How many companies are prepared to invest in their people for that change? And when you think about 60% of a workforce of over 150 million people in this country, that's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of working people. There is going to need to be some significant government response that is going to be part of that if we really are going to reach that many folks. And so that's what it is that we want to start to talk a little bit about today. Just to put that response in some context, this conversation around what this means for the global economy, folks are familiar with the World Economic Forum. They have their annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. Liz actually got a chance to go. I have not gotten my invite yet, Liz, but I'm waiting for it. It sounds like a fabulous event. I would love to hear about it. But there's a range of both economic and political leaders from around the world who come to talk about these kinds of issues. There's a report that was put out by the World Economic Forum specifically looking at the US. And it took a pretty conservative estimate about what it would take to retrain even a portion of the workers who we think are going to actually lose their jobs through these changes. And they said conservatively, just looking at a particular set of jobs, over the next 10 years, 1.4 million people, if they lost their job and we were trying to get them into a job that paid at least what they're making or more, they would cost somewhere around $34 billion, billion with a B, which sounds like an incredible level of investment. Now, there was a lot of coverage, and if folks read the newspaper accounts of what happened at Davos, there was a lot of coverage about whether or not the private sector is ready to shoulder some of that burden. And both the forum and some of the statements made by companies in attendance, and there are some who have made like some significant commitments to retraining large chunks of their workforce, and I take them at their word that they are doing that. I think that it's demonstrated that they are. But if you look kind of across that 1.5 million people, the estimate was probably we're going to get the private sector to pay somewhere between 20 and 25% of the cost of that retraining. So 80% of the retraining cost is probably going to fall back on the public sector. But an interesting observation made by the forum, and I think it's going to be part of the conversation we'll have a little bit today, is we started to think about these things not by company, but say by industry, where we were getting companies to work with each other. There's another 30% of that cost that could just be saved by getting companies to work more effectively as an industry. But that's not going to happen on its own. It's going to have to happen with government and public intervention. It's going to have to happen with the leadership of folks like yourselves that we're trying to bring those companies together. So even when we're looking at what companies are willing to do on these issues, if there's not some kind of a government involvement, a public policy involvement to get industry around the table to figure out some of these issues with us, we're sunk. So we need that public-private solution to be working together. And just to put it in a little bit of context, that $34 billion, which sounds like a very large price tag, we spend about $30 billion a year. That $34 billion is over 10 years. We spend $30 billion a year on Pell Grants. And we've had a lot of conversation over the past 24 hours about what we could be doing to make Pell Grants and federal tuition aid more available and useful to working people. So that's completely within our reach, right? The private sector spends about $650 billion on worker training every year, $650 billion. But most folks here know that a lot of that money is being spent on people with BAs or above. Probably about 85% of the money is being spent with somebody who has a bachelor's degree or at least has some college. And so if we're concerned about all of the people who are going to be impacted by these efforts, and even when industry is willing to do the right thing, how is it that we can have government as a more effective partner to make sure that everybody who's going to be impacted by these changes is going to get some of that investment? So that's what I'm going to talk about today with our expert panelists up here. So let me introduce who's going to join us for this conversation. Directly to my left is Liz Shuler. Liz is the Secretary, Treasurer, and Chief Financial Officer of the AFL-CIO. Liz started her career in Portland, Oregon, as a proud union organizer and legislative activist with the International Brotherhood of Electoral Workers, IBW Local 125. And now, as part of the leadership of the AFL-CIO, she's spearheading its outreach to the rising American electorate, young workers, women, people of color, and immigrants, and leading the Federation's efforts around the future of work, workforce development and training, industrial union councils, and women and young workers' economic empowerment. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Next to Liz is Spencer Overton. Spencer is the president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, America's black think tank here in Washington, D.C. Spencer is a tenured law professor at George Washington University, and he serves as an advisor and fellow for a number of national organizations both here in Washington and around the country. He was previously a member of the Obama administration, including serving as Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice. Spencer, welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, Christina Fitzpatrick. Christina is the Director for Economic Issues in AARP's Office of Policy Development and Integration. And in this capacity, Christina leads AARP's policy development process with the organization's staff and senior leadership across a host of issues, including Social Security, pensions, saving incentives, taxation, employment, and low-income assistance. Christina, welcome this morning.
Thank you very much.
All right. So, Liz, let's start. Since we mentioned Davos and you got to go.
I have to say I was the skunk at the garden party is how it ultimately came together. But
Although I did tell Liz when we were getting ready for this panel, I was watching her session online. Very prescient. So folks might remember that members of the Trump administration did not go because this was during the shutdown. Normally, the president and a number of the cabinet secretaries would have attended. And Liz was talking about the fact that folks should be careful about what's happening with our airline system. You folks may not get back from Switzerland back to wherever you go from. And that was literally like the morning, I think, that LaGuardia was getting ready to shut down. So she was prescient. It was true. The shutdown ended literally within hours after that. So Liz
and
knew what
even
was going on.
private jets are affected by the
Oh.
FAA.
But Liz, let me ask you about, so this conversation, since you were there, this issue about what's going to happen with the future workforce, how technology and automation is going to have an impact on workers and industries, just your general impressions about that conversation, things that you heard, things that you would have liked to have heard?
Sure. And first of all, I just want to say thank you to Andy and the National Skills Coalition because, as you said, you're doing the real work. And I'm sure most of you who come to Washington, often have views of what happens here. I know you're from all over the country, right? So you're bringing the voices of your communities and what's actually happening out there. So I just want to say thank you, because I think we're partners in crime on that, trying to keep it real here in Washington. And I love the title of this session, More Than One Future of Work, because that is exactly what we're talking about. And yes, I was in Davos. It was a very difficult decision because often we think, why would we be there with, the billionaires, right? And it is more important to have folks' voices from civil society at those tables. And the panel I was on, I was literally the only person who wasn't a CEO or, a Wall Streeter. So it was interesting in that the sessions did include a lot around skills and workforce development. That has been a theme, as everyone knows. How many of you have been in a future of work conversation? Can I just see a show of hands? There you go. Everyone's hand-wringing about what's going to happen, the job losses, as Andy outlined, and who's responsible for making the investment as we go forward. And I will say this year seemed different in that regard, that more companies seem to be talking about what their responsibility might be. And as we know over time, the pendulum has swung from, investment, say if we go back, several decades, maybe 50s, 60s, where companies were investing in their communities and they were a pillar and felt responsible in terms of what happened to their workforce, to a pendulum that has swung almost the other direction, where it's been offloaded to either government institutions, which government isn't really stepping up either, and now more and more on the individual. And that is the perspective and the lens that we look through, because individuals are shouldering the burden here, and many are coming out of, making investments, whether it's college, coming out of college with on average $30,000 worth of debt, apprenticeships or trade schools, other types of investment where the money is coming out of their pocket, and inevitably there is no job at the end of that training, unless, of course, you're in a union program, which, of course, those kind of come together, right? So that was a different tone, I would say, among the conversations I observed. More acknowledgement that investment needs to take place, that companies need to think about reskilling instead of just offloading workers who they think won't be qualified for the technology that's about to disrupt their workplaces, and again, who is responsible. And I will say the notion of sectoral partnerships, people act like it's a new idea, but it has, in our industries, and we represent almost workers in every sector of the economy, has been a model that has been so successful in the past, where you have employers recognizing that in order to guarantee the skills level in their particular sector for the future, that they all invest a little bit of money, across the sector, along with their worker partners, to ensure that you have skilled, trained, qualified professionals going into the future. And so I think that model is starting to get more attention. It just requires a leap of faith, right? That companies aren't seeing it as some kind of competitive disadvantage to them if they invest in that way. And so I guess just one example that I want to throw out is in the hospitality sector, where, if you think of union apprenticeship, a lot of people run to construction, like, oh, construction is the age-old, thing people think of. But in reality, we're expanding and modernizing and reinventing apprenticeship in industries like hospitality, highly sophisticated manufacturing. We've got the entertainment industry. We've got loads of examples where technology is disrupting the workplace. And hospitality is a key industry where we're seeing artificial intelligence, robotics coming into the workplace. But the difference is that workers have a union voice in terms of how they can come to the table with management, negotiate what that will look like, and investment in skills building for the future. And so we just saw this recently with Marriott. Many people are familiar with the strike that happened with Marriott. It was all over technology and how it's implemented. So they have bargaining language in their contract that talks about, if a worker is displaced, how does that look? What is, are they going to invest into upskilling into new and better jobs? So I think that's an example of how it can be done as a sector, and really making that investment in training together.
Excellent. I had a conversation with the reporter who was following up on some things that came out of Davos, and specifically had questions about the hospitality sector in Las Vegas and how, and our experience, and I think we've got somebody from this labor management partnership here in the room today, but the role that the union has played with most, not all, but most of the hotels in the Vegas area. I was less concerned about the displacement impact there because of the fact that there was going to be a group of people at the table together figuring this out, as opposed to just kind of implementing it and see what the impact is going to be on workers within that industry. But that's not the case in every part of hospitality, for sure.
And the Trading Center in Las Vegas, I would say, is a model where essentially all the hotel chains, except for one, I believe, have invested in a training center that takes folks from entry-level jobs to room attendant to catering and management, all through a cycle within an industry. And the hotel rooms are actually set up exactly as you would see them on the strip, right? And so you see the training program, and it's basically catered to the particular employer, so that you have a worker that's basically ready to go immediately upon graduation. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So on this theme, was it last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, when the AFL decided to create a Future of Work Commission? Why did the AFL decide to do that? What's the purpose? What's it been talking about?
Yes, and as you said, everyone's talking about future of work, right? So the one thing that we see, though, is that the future of work never seems to include a worker perspective, which is so unusual, right? You have foundations and think tanks and, government folks all convening people, but don't necessarily think about working people at that table. And that was what was really driving us, is to think about what would a worker perspective on future of work look like? What is labor's lane, so to speak, when we talk about future of work? And because obviously the disruption that you outlined in the beginning is very much a concern for people. And if the fourth industrial revolution, as they call it, lands like we think it will be the biggest issue facing the labor movement, I think, perhaps ever, right? But history does repeat, because if the productivity gains that we see from future of work and technology materialize like we think they will, we could see inequality widen if we don't have the right policy prescriptions in place to make sure those gains are shared. And if we don't have a way for workers to be at the table figuring out how they can get a piece of the pie from all of the wealth that's created, then that's a problem too. And in the past, we've seen that unions and collective bargaining and now collective action in different forms have been a mechanism for people to come together and bargain for their share of the wealth that they're helping to create. So that is one of our concerns going forward in future of work, is thinking about, technology in and of itself is neither inherently evil or good, right? It's how you use it. And so that is, we want to see policies in place that make sure that, we're making those decisions in the right way proactively and not just sitting back waiting for bad things to happen. So that was the driver.
Excellent. So Spencer, Joint Center has been paying attention to some of these issues, and I know you've been particularly focused on how automation is likely to impact certain groups of workers, particularly ones that we often don't talk a lot about in the usual conversations that we have about the future work. Do you want to share a little bit about what you've found?
Sure, and you talked about America's Black think tank. Joint Center was founded in 1970 to support Black elected officials. So you remember the Voting Rights Act in 1965, all these new Black voters, new activists who become elected officials. The Joint Center was intended to support them and supported people like Maynard Jackson and Doug Wilder and Shirley Chisholm and a variety of folks. Today, we're focused on the future of work in Black communities. And Andy, I just want to, thank you as we have moved into this. National Skills Coalition has been a great partner, as Hareen, our workforce development director's been there and working with you. So thank you so much. So a traditional discussion here is, will the future of work increase the raw number of jobs or decrease the number of jobs? And there's started to be a discussion about, will the future of work disproportionately impact low-income workers? We found that was incomplete, that more needed to be done. So a couple years ago, we looked at some numbers, and we found that 31% of Latino workers in the United States are concentrated in just 30 jobs at high risk to automation, and 27% of Black workers are concentrated in these 30 jobs, right? So these are like fast food workers, your drivers, et cetera. And so African Americans, for example, are 1.5 times more likely to be cashiers than whites. African Americans are 3 times more likely to be bus drivers and taxi drivers than whites. Now, somebody might say, well, isn't this just economics, Andy? Like, well, if you just help the poor people, everything will be all okay. We'll lift all boats. And we would say, at least in terms of the beginning of our research, that particular communities face some unique challenges, right? So if you think about African Americans, and you all are familiar with the, study of resumes and implicit bias and names like Jamal not getting callbacks, whereas other names getting callbacks. A factor like implicit bias is relevant when people are making job transitions here. Issues like residential segregation. As you all know, black families and black children who are poor are much more likely to live in areas of concentrated poverty than white poor folks, right? And so that has implications in terms of transportation to jobs, access to jobs. It has implications in terms of education, a lot of other things. Net worth, another issue. Basically, white households have a net worth that is 10 times that of black households. And that has implications in terms of having money to get education, right? Being able to get education, having other opportunities. If you're out of work, and being able to make the bills and get a mortgage to cover bills for a couple of months. Also, social networks. Are you connected? Do you know about new opportunities? Now, this matters in terms of policy. I think there's this conventional wisdom, Andy, where, hey, GI Bill. It's great, this is wonderful, this has created the American middle class, this has been a great thing, right? But GI Bill, if you look at the education benefit of $500, right? In the South, there were HBCUs that didn't have the capacity to add black returning veterans, and black folks couldn't go to the University of Alabama and other places. There were places like Princeton and Harvard and other places in the North that only allowed a few black folks to come in, and as a result, many more white folks took advantage, much higher percentage than black returning veterans. The mortgage guarantee, federal mortgage guarantee, basically you could only get a mortgage in areas that met a certain rating, and areas that were deemed undesirable or where there were a lot of racial minorities, you couldn't get and take advantage of that federal guarantee in terms of mortgage, right? And so something that is definitely race neutral, something that's intended to benefit folks, basically increases disparities in wealth between whites and blacks here, something that created the middle class, right? And so my point here is, as we're thinking about the future now, we need to bake racial equity in the design from the beginning and think about these things in the beginning.
And do you have ideas about how we might start to do that? Like, let's use the example of the GI Bill or college access. Like, what are some ways that we could consider doing that?
Well, I do. I mean, there are a variety of ways. If we think about certainly the federal government has a role to play, especially in terms of concentrating resources in areas with high concentrations of poverty, in terms of skilling. For me, there are two big issues. One's the immediate issue of adults now who need to be able to transition, and we don't want to write them off. Sometimes there's this notion of, let's just focus on pre-K through 12, let's write off people, and people have dreams too, right? We can't write them off, right? So there's obviously this targeted focus in terms of adults, in terms of skilling and getting folks in. But then I think on the local level also, we've got to think about the next generation in terms of pre-K through 12. I'm very concerned about this divide of kind of innovation, information, STEM jobs, and then the rest of folks just kind of being service providers to this class, and having a kind of economic growth class that is not very diverse at all, right? And then this kind of support class that is, diverse, et cetera. And so those people are employed, technically, they've got a, low unemployment rate, but are they helping to drive the economy? Do they have the same benefits and opportunities? And is there an opportunity for economic mobility? So federal government, certainly local governments have to play a role. A challenge here, obviously, is limited tax base in places like Gary, Indiana, et cetera. And then also in terms of employers, you talked about employers. There's this notion of employers saying, hey, well, you're not skilled. And we need these skilled workers, and it's really on you. If you just had the skills, there wouldn't be a problem, right? And so this notion of employers taking some responsibility, as you said here, right? And employers being sensitive to this issue of diversity. So as we acculturate folks in terms of, hey, the world's changing, we need to get some skills, this is happening, as opposed to just, you know, you get your pink slip tomorrow kind of thing, like hold it back, here, we want stability. You know, the acculturation piece. But then also in terms of being sensitive to black folks being able to make that transition, and Latinos and others, on-ramps. So as opposed to just protecting those who are currently employed from kind of an entrenched standpoint, how do we have on-ramps for other people who are unemployed or who are on the margins of society, you know, and companies consciously doing that. And we will talk more specifics later.
And you've got a lot of folks in this room who are doing just that work. This issue about where companies are playing a role in this, and I think, I mean, and we obviously work, all of us here are working with companies in our local communities. We as an organization work with business leaders who have decided that investing in their people is a key part of their business strategy. Smaller companies sometimes have some challenges in that. So it is also trying to figure out kind of like where it is that we can be a partner with them, where the organizations in this room can be a partner with them, how we can bring them together as an industry so that we can work on that together. I think it's an important part of this.
And one quick point here, Andy, kind of building on that, something we're looking at, we don't have definitive data on this right now, but as opposed to having a one-size-fits-all mindset with regard to training, you know, recognizing there may be some differences, and just looking at the data, what is effective in terms of populations and understanding that and providing some tailored reskilling and training opportunities, right? And then also there's this issue, something we're seeing and we're collecting more data, is this retention issue. Right? So there may be people of color, right, who have the skills to participate, and you've got kind of mid-level managers who have, let's say, different cultural expectations that are not related to the job, and there is kind of a disconnect there and a lack of retention in terms of those employees of color who, again, are skilled, are doing what needs to be done to move along. So some, I don't know if it's training or some kind of recognition in terms of management of how do we onboard and retain people as opposed to focusing on some, let's say, less significant cultural biases to kind of have an excuse to you know, knock people out.
Right, and I think this issue of employee retention, worker retention, how you take the folks who've already brought value to a company,
right,
and when even as the company is changing because of this technology, that's something that we as a country do not have great strategies for. I mean, there are companies that have good strategies. As a policy environment, we have a lot of work to do to kind of figure out how to keep folks on the job as much as we're trying to figure out how to get folks back into a job once, if something's happened where they've been displaced. So Christina, let me turn things over to you. So AARP, everybody knows here who AARP is. I get the mailings. I haven't signed up yet, but yes, I've crossed the threshold. But why would AARP care about something like the future of work? Where is that relevant to your membership?
Great. Thank you, Andy. I'm really glad to be here and really glad to see all of you working on these issues. Glad to hear that you're going to be going to Capitol Hill on tomorrow, right? Because when the members of Congress hear from their constituents about what's important to them, it really makes a difference. So AARP is thinking about the future of work, and one of the things that is true for all of us is we don't know what that future of work is going to look like. There are all these projections about number of jobs created and lost, about the impact on tasks and skills that people are doing. But we are seeing some seeds that have been planted and have started to grow, and we can prepare now to address those things. So I'll give you one example. One of the most important things that AARP works on in terms of employment issues is age discrimination. It is It is alive and well. As Spencer talked about, he referred to some of these audit studies where you send out resumes of various kinds. You're testing different things. And people have done that in terms of age to see how many people get called back if their resume indicates that they are an older worker rather than a younger worker. And younger workers in one study were 40% more likely to be called for an interview than older workers. So that's something that we have to work on. And one of the things we have to realize is that it's not just about the jobs and the tasks and how the future of work is going to manifest in the way people work. It's already affecting how people are hired. And if you don't get hired, you don't get to work. So I'll give you a few examples. Artificial intelligence is being used now in the hiring process. So you may know that if you are applying for a job today, you need to tailor your resume to have the right words in it. You look at the job description and you want to make sure that you are going to come up when the computer is scanning your resume, that you're going to have a match. That's how you're going to be more likely to be called in for an interview. And if your job description includes words like digital native or energetic or recent college graduates, the older workers are going to be screened out. And employers need to think about that when they are developing their job descriptions so that they are focusing on the skills that are needed for the job rather than letting their assumptions about what older workers can do, especially in terms of technology, rather than younger people. Another way that artificial intelligence is being used is to direct job listings at younger workers. So Facebook, it has come out that they allow businesses to target their job ads, and they have used it to target younger workers, for example, or men rather than women. And we all know that Facebook knows a lot about you, so they can target in a lot of ways. I was recently shopping for a mattress and did one Google search, and that afternoon, what was being advertised on my Facebook feed but mattresses. They know what we're doing, and so they can target. Another way that discrimination can show up in the job application process is by companies can use information about their current workers to develop what they think of as success profiles. And recently, Amazon tested a way of using data, and not just about work performance. This is about everything that Facebook and Google and everybody else know about you to create these profiles. And Amazon was testing one kind of way of using this big data and artificial intelligence to identify candidates, and what they found was that it was suggesting only men. There were no women that were making it through this screen of artificial intelligence. So we need to do a lot more to think about how artificial intelligence can affect the workplace, but also can affect the hiring process. And we know that algorithms are only as good as the data that is being fed into them. And we need a way to make sure that we can hold companies accountable for these algorithms, how they're using them, and the outcomes that they produce, which may in fact be biased.
Incredibly important set of issues for us to be aware of. We all are immersed, like we are all part of that system now, whether we know it or not, right? I mean, it is something that we all need to kind of start to take some collective responsibility for in terms of kind of monitoring and making sure that it's being used effectively, or not discriminating against people. I think one set of stats that I'm sure you know, I just pulled it up out of a Deloitte report that was looking at Bureau of Labor Statistics. We are, as a nation, getting older. Our workforce is getting older. I'm getting older. Two stats that really stood out to me taking a look at this is the number of people who are going to be working past the ages of 65 or even 75. So the BLS data shows if you look from 1994 to 2024, that it's basically a doubling of the percentage of people who are going to be working past the age of 65. I think they're estimating that 1994 is about 17%. It's going to be 30% of people past the age of 65 that are going to be working. 10% of the people past the age of 75 are going to be likely working. And as we have a lot of these conversations about technology and the future of work, there's some certain set of assumptions, to your point, about folks who have been using technology literally since they were born or very shortly thereafter are going to be more adaptable to some of these changes on the workplace than older workers. And even though our country, as a set of cohorts compared to other countries, our older workers actually in terms of reading and math probably score better than a lot of other countries in the world. But still, on digital literacy, our older workers have less of those skills than, say, our younger cohort. What are we going to do about that if there's so many people who are already figuring that they're going to be in the workforce? And we've already made some decisions about whether or not that cohort of workers is going to be able to be retrained for some of this new technology on the job.
It's a really important point. And one thing I want to start off by saying is that I think that some people feel like we have these older workers who grew up in a time before the internet, before email, before Facebook, and that once we get them out of the workforce, everything's going to be okay. You know, we have the millennials, they know technology, and then they're just going to make their way through and it's going to be fine. But we need to remember that even millennials are going to become older workers someday. And there will be technology as it evolves that they're not native in anymore. They're digital natives, but 30 years from now, they're going to be some other kind of native that they're not going to be. And so this is a challenge that is here to stay. Another challenge that I think partly is driving the stats that you just mentioned about older worker participation in the labor force is that we're all getting older, and it's rather striking just how much older we can expect to be. So there are projections out there that 50% of today's 10-year-olds can expect to live to 100. So that's stunning. That's stunning. And that means that if you retire at 65, which a lot of people retire before that, if you retire at 65, that's 35 years of retirement that you have to fund. And so thinking that work is going to need to be a part of that. We talk at ARP about the 100-year life and how thinking about work and leisure and education is going to need to evolve so that we move from a 3-stage life of education and work and retirement to a multi-stage life where we're blending these things as we go along. And that's why skills training is so important, because as people are working longer, they're going to need to update their skills. And we're going to need to recognize that people's skills and abilities and the way they learn changes as you get older. Older workers, there's a stereotype that they can't learn new skills, but that's not true. They can learn new skills. They might need to learn them in a different way, but that's something that we can manage. We just need to be willing to develop those kinds of programs.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to start to pivot now to the policy conversation. So we've got a lot of different challenges that we've kind of laid out here. We've recognized that different workers in different work environments have different needs when we're looking at how it is that we're going to be training them to hang on to their current job, or whether we're going to be retraining them to find another position. So I want to kind of talk through that a little bit, and I want to just give a heads up that we want to involve folks here in the room in that conversation. So people who are running mics, if you want to get ready, because I want to make sure that we can do some Q&A for the balance of this session as well. But so let me put it out to the panel here. Often in these future work conversations, the term lifelong learning comes up. And it's kind of a catch-all phrase. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different folks. Although I will say that for the most part, at least in most conversations I'm in, but I'm interested to hear kind of if you've heard it the same way, that often lifelong learning is something that an individual is managing. Like everybody needs to kind of commit to this idea of lifelong learning. And we have different policies that we've looked at in terms of how it is that people can be providing more of their own resources. We can get their company perhaps match some of those resources, even getting public resources in. There's a proposal up on the Hill around lifelong learning accounts, where it is that we can kind of make them somewhat tax incentivized. I'm just curious, like in this conversation about lifelong learning and the role of the individual versus other players in this solution, like where do we think the right balance is on some of those issues? Liz, I'll let you go first.
Well, first of all, I wanted to mention, of course, people want to learn, they want to improve their skills, they want to get better jobs. And I think we can safely assume that going forward, no matter what the workplace looks like in the future. But if they cannot support their families with a decent job, learning becomes secondary, if not impossible, right? Because they're struggling to put food on the table, they're trying to take care of their kids. And I remember being in the room with an executive who talked about the training program that they were so excited to provide. And one of the questions was, well, what kind of resistance did you face from the workforce in terms of, you know, them wanting to get this access to training and taking the company up on it? It was like, resistance? No. They're not resistant to learning, they're just resistant to figuring out how to manage their schedule and find the time to include this in their day, right? And a lot of this has to do with the economy and how it's functioning and how people are working more than one job right now to sustain their families. And if we don't think about that as part of the mix of the future of work, we're going to be in real trouble because you know, that's just not a way to sustain yourself, right? Let alone think about healthcare and retirement security and all the things that go along with that. And I will say that we deal both with the incumbent workforce, the quote seasoned, I don't like to say old, I like to say seasoned workers, and young people coming up. And there is a real difference in their approaches and the way they think about things. But older workers that we deal with, more seasoned workers, have been adapting to technology over time for decades. And I will say that's part of what having the union in the workplace makes technology adoption a lot easier, right? Because we're kind of negotiating how that takes place and what it looks like for people. But young people who are digital natives, I guess you called them, are excited about technology and the changes, but they're actually more sour on the economy and democracy right now. And that was one thing I wanted to add to what you were saying, is I think Harvard did a study last year that talked about to millennials whether they thought it was important to live in a democracy. Only 25% of millennials thought it was important to live in a democracy. And you can imagine, this is the first generation that's grown up in this broken economy, seeing their parents go back to work because they couldn't, or they retired and then couldn't sustain themselves, had to go back to work after the crash. They're in debt up to their eyeballs. Their job prospects are very grim. And so they're equating that with our political system, right? And so it's a threat to our economy, it's a threat to our democracy, and it's something that the future of work is only going to exacerbate if we don't get the right policy prescriptions in place. And I will say one thing that we're looking at, of course, is, you know, with the threat of climate change, a lot of people are talking in very similar terms about job losses with climate change as they are with future of work, and thinking about how to make this transition a just transition. And we've thought about, you know, helping bridge workers to pension, or again, investing in training schemes similar to we did with trade adjustment assistance, a modern way of doing that. But the notion of just transition for the future of work is something that we're doing a lot of thinking about through our future of work process, and we hope that we'll have a suite of policy prescriptions to that end.
So I definitely want to come back to just transition and TAA, two things I know we want to talk about. Anyone else who's got some thoughts about this lifelong learning idea?
I do want to just quickly jump in here, Andy. I just think right now, from a policy standpoint, we're like nibbling at the edges, right? And I think politicians here in DC, right, They don't know how to talk about these issues here in terms of Republicans and Democrats are not really fluent. They don't have a language to talk about this. And if you look at, China or other places, these places have like a 50, 100-year game plan here. And we're dealing with, 2-year cycles from a planning standpoint, right? And so this, I think, is really why you all are incredibly important. Everybody here in DC, respects Andy. He's great. But the fact that you all can go to your members and you can hold them accountable and you have some knowledge, some subject matter knowledge of this area, no one is in their right mind, Republican or Democrat, right, is against this notion of more Americans having skills and being able to contribute in terms of this economy. It's a nonpartisan issue, and so you all are such an important voice in terms of what you're doing. I hope we move ahead. If we don't move ahead, just frankly, one of the reasons we're focused on this issue is, if America as a whole isn't going to move ahead, I want to make sure Karen Freeman Wilson in Gary, Indiana moves ahead. I want to make sure that folks in Baltimore have the mindset of, it's frankly so easy because of our history to be trapped in the past. And, there are places like Singapore, South Korea, Estonia, Rwanda, that have basically said, we're going to move forward in a strategic way here, right? I hope we can do that as a nation. If we can't, then my hope is that in Gary and in Baltimore and the Black Belt of the South, folks pick up that and say, we gotta move forward here.
I hope we can do it as a nation. Christine, did you have any thoughts about this lifelong learning question?
I do. There are 2 points that I'd like to make. One is about the responsibility for lifelong learning. And so there are a couple things about that too. So I think it's unreasonable to think that individuals are going to do this completely on their own. Just Liz, as you were describing, it takes a lot of discipline to do education online on your own. And I know people who have done it, but I think it's unreasonable to think that everybody is going to be able to do that with their family responsibilities, if they're working 2 jobs, and even if they're just regular old folks. It's tough. So we need to think about that in terms of responsibility, where the responsibility lies. And I also want to make sure that we are thinking about what kinds of skills that people are going to need. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I promise I'm going somewhere with this. How many of you watched the Super Bowl? Not that many? Okay, a lot of you. How many of you didn't watch?
No New England commentary.
How many of you didn't watch the Super Bowl because the Saints were robbed? Yeah. I have family in Louisiana, so I'm sensitive to that. So for those of you who didn't watch, I'll just let you know there were several commercials there that were about artificial intelligence and about some of the limitations of artificial intelligence. And one in particular was TurboTax. They were talking about their live CPAs that they have, and there was this humanoid kind of robot that said, I want to be a live CPA someday. Somebody said, no, sorry, you don't have the emotional complexity to be a CPA, sorry. And the robot's very sad about that. So that's pointing to the fact of what people are saying is that there are technology skills that people are going to need, but there are also human skills. This is where we have the comparative advantage of being able to deal with uncertainty and make connections with people and help them solve problems and things like that. Now, one thing that experience brings you is those things, to have perspective and to be able to coach people and things like that. So that's one way in which older workers, some of them have that advantage, and that's something we need to think about helping people to learn.
So this idea that we have incredibly valuable workers both who are worthy of investments in their skills to keep them on the job, and they can also be part of the reskilling process with colleagues, including some of those younger workers who are coming onto the company for the first time, who may have some very incredible technical skills, but how to apply them within this particular work environment. Somebody who's seasoned and has been working in that environment for a while could lend something to their learning to make them a more effective worker.
And hopefully we're changing the expectation and the culture around it, because I think there was always these milestones growing up. You just graduate from high school, you just graduate from college, and then get a job, and you're good, you're set. That is definitely going to be changing, right? And so what are we doing culturally to manage or set that expectation?
Yeah, and in terms of the gig economy, certainly being more entrepreneurial, that is a part of the culture, of course, right? But I'll tell you, if Liz is not skilled and she doesn't have opportunity, this isn't about individual fairness, right? That affects me. Right, that means that Liz can't buy something from me. That means that we as a country are less than. So it's not just about a fairness or let's just put it on the individual. Just as a structure, we are better off, right, when Liz has skills here. And so we want to make sure that she has all opportunities to maximize her human potential. And let me just say this, right? Not just the human potential to be the average American, right? Oh, let's fix these broken black people and make them average, but ensuring that all Americans really can just meet their human potential as a whole, right?
Yeah. And just to add on to that, we need to think about that when more people are working, we're growing the economy. That's where productivity comes from. There's some idea that we need to get older workers out of the workforce to let younger people into the workforce. But just as Spencer was saying, if you have a lot of people out of the workforce, your economy slows down. And those workers, those remaining workers, suffer by that. So we need to think about growing this pie and that it's good for all of us.
So let me distill a couple policy lessons I might have gotten from where our conversation has been so far. So one, people should always have the opportunity to learn. We should see that anybody in the workforce, regardless of age, is worthy of that investment. We should think about the fact that a lot of those workers could be part of the retraining process on the job, not just for themselves, but for other colleagues. That seems important. This idea that while individuals can and should be given more opportunities to take advantage of learning opportunities, that we read to Spencer's point about kind of a nationwide rethinking of this. Like we stop public education in this country at age 18, or maybe and subsidize it to some extent to age 21. But if we truly think that we need to retrain tens of millions of people currently in the workforce, we need to redefine what public education is in this country, right? That we need to be thinking about people much later on in life should have same access to education as somebody who we've guaranteed it to who's of a younger age. That seems to be something that we need to be talking about. Let's talk a little bit about for those folks who do lose a job. We've already had conversations about for some people, because of categorical exclusions and discrimination, there's going to be some folks who are just by definition going to have a harder time to get back into jobs. We've covered some of that a little bit. How about just on what it is that we could be doing as a country to make it easier in an economy where people are going to be changing jobs a lot more often, beyond just what's happening in the business cycle, where industries are changing significantly. We've had some conversations here in Washington. The Obama administration tried to come up with a thing they called the Universal Dislocated Worker Program. So they said, what are we doing for trade-impacted workers? What are we doing with our unemployment insurance system and our dislocated worker program under the Workforce Investment Act and then under WIOA? Could we kind of come up with something that was a little bit more comprehensive, that included training, but also included some of the other things that we know folks need? Income support, healthcare support, other kinds of support services that are kind of getting them into that next job. I'm curious, do we think that that is a massive investment for the number of people that we're talking about who might be impacted? Do we think that we've got the ability to grow a coalition of organizations that could kind of come around and say, whether you've lost your job because of trade or technology or even just what's happening in the business cycle, that we as a country are going to make a commitment to work with you however long we need to get you back into a decent paying job? Do we have the ability to make that happen in this country?
Absolutely. Share your optimism, and I think a lot of it has to do with getting back to the community level, because Washington is stuck, right? Not much is happening in DC these days, and it's really about pushing this out to the community, regional, state, local level, and making that investment in those partnerships. And I know that word is often overused, but we can make it meaningful, and I think we have models that work, that we can expand on. And I probably sound like a broken record, but certainly in the labor management world we live in, one of the things you didn't mention was expanding and modernizing apprenticeship. And that is a work-based learning model that is a direct path to a job. You earn while you learn, so that you're not accruing debt, that works. And so I think, expanding on apprenticeship, partnerships at the community level, and really kind of taking risks and experimenting and not being afraid to fail, and thinking long term too. I think our economy is so driven by short-termism and return on investment and profits that we aren't taking the risks we need to, because no one wants to fail in the short term and look more toward the long-term investment that we need in this country.
Other thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that I would answer your question, yes. We have the will to do it, and we need to figure out the way to move forward. It's particularly important for older workers because once they lose their jobs, they have a much harder time getting back into them. So while their unemployment rate is lower, they stay unemployed longer. And the most recent stats I saw were that of unemployed older workers, a quarter of them have been unemployed for at least 6 months versus 10% for younger workers. And one of the things that we need to think about in terms of what we're going to do for these workers is not just when you get displaced, what do we do for you, and that's important, and to expand these programs so it's not just about trade. It's about if you get displaced, how are we going to help you? And one argument is that it's good for the economy, just as we were talking about earlier. But also we need to figure out how to get people to stay in their jobs, how we can get employers to retain these workers, because that's a way to prevent them from being unemployed in the first place. And that's it's good for workers, and it's good for everybody.
Absolutely necessary. We've got to design a system to deal with the problems ahead of us, right, as opposed to the past. I would say that, again, workers who are dislocated, it's important. We need to be concerned. We also need to provide on-ramps for folks who are unemployed or underemployed as well, right? As opposed to just focusing on folks who could be dislocated by globalization or automation. I think another big piece here is the pre-K piece. It is important. So we definitely need and this goes to your lifelong learning, a system so that, technological change is happening all the time, and so we have workers who have skills, right? But the pre-K piece in a system of education that's based on, local property tax and moving to a particular haven, that isn't going to really advance us as a nation. And so this notion of figuring out this pre-K piece so that, we're getting talent from everywhere in the country and the whole population as opposed to certain segments, I think that's a part of the long-term piece. And I know we're focused right now on older workers, and that's important as well, but I think it's all a part of the solution.
As the husband of a pre-K teacher, I support your notion.
I would love to hear too from the audience, if we can, at some point, about TAA-like ideas, right? That we all think that TAA isn't the model,
right?
Probably, right?
There are parts of it, and so just TA, so trade adjustment assistance, right? So we commit to people who've been impacted by trade that will retrain them, that they'll get unemployment insurance, that will pay for their health care for a period of time.
And the famous, truck driver to a software developer kind of example everybody uses
Right.
for the future of work,
Right.
which, yeah.
Right, so the basket of resources is important. Its application has been uneven, I would say, at best, and we certainly have not scaled it. So that's a great, thank you, Liz, for reminding me. We've forgotten about the folks out here. So let's get the mics around. If folks have thoughts about that particular issue or any other questions that they have, and try to keep it short because I have to say it again so the folks on Facebook can actually hear what you're asking. So keep it tight, and then I can repeat it. Way in the back in the corner there. And if you could tell us who you are, that would be great, too.
I will. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Gary, Officer, President, CEO of Senior Service America. This has been an exceptional panel. Exceptional. So you guys deserve a round of applause. You kept my attention.
Good job, panelists.
But I have a question and I have a sort of suggestion. While waiting to speak for the last 10 minutes, Spencer mentioned, and I think Liz had also mentioned the World Economic Forum and the spend per GDP among competing economies on workforce training. Now I have a list here that says Singapore, 1% of GDP, South Korea, 1% of GDP, and I'm rounding up. Japan, 1% of GDP. Australia, 0.8% of GDP, and the list goes on. The US spends 0.35% of GDP on workforce training. That's an astonishingly low number, and that has to be a talking point for future conversations. That's one.
Really, really good.
Keep it tight, Gary. I got it. So GDP, what percentage is this country spending of GDP and it's investing in its people? Second part.
That's 0.35%.
Yep.
The second part is I go to quite a few of these conferences, and I'm kind of new to the workforce space, but I'm not new to community development. And when I go to a workforce space on issues around jobs for the future, I find very few employers present. When I go to the corporate side, I'm the only nonprofit guy in the room. We have to break the silos. We have the unions here, we have thought leaders here, we have practitioners here. We've got to find a common ground where we can engage the other side so we can drive up the spend to support our workforce for the future.
Let me give the panel a chance to respond to that. So are we as a country spending enough as a portion of our incredibly prosperous economy and our people? And although I will say that there's a lot of folks here who are working with their companies and actually coming here to DC on occasion to talk about these issues, what more could we be doing to bring the business community and other stakeholders together to move some of these things forward? Any thoughts on either one of those issues?
I'll take the first question. No, we are not spending enough. So,
You're playing to the crowd.
yeah.
I will say I just met with the unions from Singapore, and they are doing deep sectoral analysis of where the jobs are going, how the displacement's going to land, how they equip themselves in terms of investment for the future, and it was all done in a tripartite formulation with business and unions and government all at the table, of course, academics and others. But we don't have anything like that in the United States, and I think that's part of the problem is that we are siloed, and everyone's kind of looking out for themselves and their piece of the pie here, and we're never going to get anywhere unless we all come together and figure this out, as a country. Yeah.
I mean, the good news is people here were instrumental at least getting sector partnerships written into WIOA. There's an expectation of new industry partnerships in the context of how the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act is going to be implemented. But we have a host of other things that we think we can do in the higher education system. There's a whole other set of things that we could do just on the community basis. And I know we never got a chance to talk about just transition, but this idea about how it is that we're involving local communities and thinking about as their local economy is changing, whether it's because of the green economy or other things that are happening there, where it is that we could have a lot more folks at the table to start to figure out these issues together. Public policy, we think, needs to play an initial role to help create the table for those folks to come together. I think it's an important part of the solution.
I'd just like to add, I think part of the low spending on these kinds of programs comes from the idea that people need to take care of themselves, that it's their responsibility to get the training that they need. And that's reflected in other things too. So in the work context, in retirement planning, retirement savings, a lot of people used to have defined benefit plans. So if you worked at a company, you were accruing benefits. When you got to retirement, you were guaranteed a payment for the rest of your life. That's declined precipitously, except for in a lot of union-based organizations. But the rest of us are having to save, if we're lucky, through a retirement-based savings plan, a 401k. And so there's a lot more shift to the individual in terms of investment risk and saving enough and how much is enough. And we're seeing that more and more in these alternative work arrangements, in the gig economy, where people are trying to piece together work to support themselves, support their families. That contributes to a lot of income volatility, and it contributes to them trying to figure out how they're going to get health insurance, how they're going to save for retirement. When you're on your own, you have to contribute to Social Security, not just the worker portion, but also what the employer is putting in. So there's a theme here, and we need to think about it, I think, holistically, and how we can address how it shows up in these different ways.
Here, here.
Let me see a question on this side of the room. Jesse, yeah?
Hi, I'm Leslie Hirsch. I am Assistant Commissioner of Labor in New Jersey. I have a question for the whole panel. Yesterday in the pre-conference workshop around data quality, I think one of the stunning takeaways that a lot of us had in post-workshop discussion was the difficulty of even getting people within workforce development to be on the same page. With regard to accountability, transparency, and even what our outcomes and goals are. We looked at Higher Education Act, at TANF, we looked at WIOA, we looked at Perkins, and all of them are measuring success in a really different way. So to the panel's point about thinking broadly, about early childhood to older adulthood and thinking long-term, and more like the 1,500-year plan than the 1 or 2 or 4-year plan. What's your experience about what works to shatter these barriers and develop a multifaceted strategy? Or I could shorten that question to, how can we become Singapore?
Thank you, Leslie. So the question was, how can we become Singapore? Or how is it that we can develop a set of systems that are trying to help people throughout the entirety of their life? Sounds like data systems is a part of that solution in terms of tracking it, but I'm curious what the panel has thinking they have on any of those questions.
Well, I think one of the things that you touched on was evaluations. How do we know what we're doing and what works? And coordinating that across the country is essential so that we know, and we break that down. So we're not just talking about what works for the average worker. We're understanding that different workers need different things, and we need to think about different demographic groups. One thing that AARP is doing, our AARP Foundation, has a program called Back to Work 50+, where they're partnering with workforce investment boards and community colleges to try to get older workers what they need to get back to work. And so that is a network, and they're trying to do that kind of coordination and do that kind of evaluation so we know something, have some real data there. And that's something that we're trying to scale. We haven't gotten that far in terms of scaling yet, but that's the plan. So that's a piece of the puzzle. And obviously there's more to be done in terms of at the state level, what these different state and local governments and the federal government can do in that regard, making those investments.
Other thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I think getting back to this notion of different sectors coming together and having conversations, I think Singapore, there was a lot of centralization, and that is just not who we are as a country. And so the notion of different sectors in terms of businesses and, local governments and unions kind of coming together and, recognizing the weaknesses of different folks, businesses may be uniquely situated to train people because they know what they need, but they may not want to pay to train somebody for their competitor to snatch away, right? So getting folks, I think, in the same room. And then I also have to say this, and I'm sorry, y'all. Like the emperor has no clothes, the wizard is behind the curtain. These folks are going to follow you who are here in DC, right? Like these people up here, they don't have the magic answer here in terms of solving this issue. And you all being able to go up and demand some things and then also follow up and stay in touch with these offices and provide some leadership, that I think is a way to moving us toward Singapore, because the centralized, master plan, I don't think is here.
And I think New Jersey is a great example of how you can really invite everyone in, have a table where folks can participate. I know working people feel very comfortable with the way the new government and the regime in New Jersey has been operating. And you mentioned data quality and accountability and transparency, and I think in this era of the coming technology, we all need to get on board with those concepts, in our structures and government, but also in our own organizations. And I will say the labor movement, we're looking at that, trying to figure out how we modernize, how we can actually learn more about our own members and use that data and information to promote a healthier democracy, because democracy really is being threatened right now. I mean, if you think about all of the barriers there are to more people participating. So we're looking at ourselves, and I think everyone in this room probably is doing the same, but I would just say let's again have that risk-taking culture and really think through how we can be better in terms of the data piece.
Excellent. Let me go back over on this side of the room. Melissa, there's somebody here? Yes, whoever has the mic. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So we have someone over here? All right, go ahead.
Hey, good evening. Actually, good morning, Andy and the panel. Beyond...
Gerard, do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, I apologize. Gerard Melanson, Baton Rouge Community College, and a partner with the National Council for Workforce Education, a partner with NCWE, in NCS. Beyond reading, for the panel, beyond reading the great research that's provided by the National Skills Coalition, what are you reading on a daily basis to keep sharp, to keep moving forward, and without being paralyzed with your work on a daily basis? And can you share that wisdom for us to keep us motivated and keep us moving forward?
I mean, I hate to point to...
We're very energetic up here. We're ready to jump right in on that question.
One of the things we're doing is partnering with academic institutions. Obviously, a lot of reading goes into that in terms of the reports they're churning out, but Carnegie Mellon is a partnership we have, MIT and Stanford, 3 institutions that are very much on the cutting edge to try to get ahead of the development of technology and how it's going to land in the workplace. And I will say the World Economic Forum, we've mentioned them many times, but they're churning out a ton of information that I think is, the reports that they've been putting out, particularly in the workforce development space, have been good. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm like a books guy, both in terms of reading and then also audiobooks. So maybe 3 days ago I finished, you all have probably all read this, I think it's The New Geography of Jobs, and just other books like that that are related to technology and the impact on the economy in terms of the future.
Mm-hmm. One resource I would recommend is the Brookings Institution. They have a new center, I think it's called the Center for Technology Innovation or something like that, and they have a great cadre of people who are thinking about the future of work and how technology is going to affect it. So they produce a lot of reports. They have a lot of gatherings, events that you can follow online. So I would recommend them.
And I'm sorry, just a quick. I'm also reading right now AI 3.0, and my sense is that a lot of these books are probably read by tech folk who aren't incredibly diverse, and I'm trying to kind of do a little translation and really kind of understand what are the implications for average folk and, average Americans.
So this is a great way for me to remind folks that if you're watching on Facebook, on our Facebook page, and if you're here in the room on the resource page in your Summit app, we have a whole list of resources from these organizations on work that they're doing in this particular area. There's some things there from National Skills Coalition and some of its partners as well. So we all have some learning to do together and from each other. And so I would recommend you take a look at some of those things. We as an organization want to continue to have this conversation with all of you. We want to continue to have it with our national colleagues up here as well in order to be able to move this conversation forward, particularly here in Washington, but we know with all of the new governors that many of your states are governors who are trying to figure out some of these things as well. And we want them to be coming up with the ideas that are informed by the work that you're doing every day. Because we think that ultimately the partnerships that you're building, the models of that can serve for public policy is going to take us a lot further into the future on some of these issues. So first, let me thank our panel. They've just been absolutely incredible. Thank you, Liz, Spencer, and Christina. I want to thank our audience on Facebook Live. I was glad to have you here. Come back and join us in the room next year. It's even better when you do it here in person. And so thanks, everybody. I have one announcement that I want to make about our sessions. So the next round of sessions on apprenticeship and safety net policy are going to be back in the Empire and Palladian rooms. So they're going to be starting in about 15 minutes or so. And then I just want to encourage everybody to try to get back here as close to noon as possible for our lunch, because our two members of Congress are going to be arriving right about at the top of the hour, and want to see if we can have everybody in their seats so we can get our full time with them as well. So thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your morning. We'll see you back here at lunch.
Thank you.
And enjoyed the conversation.